The piercing whine arrived before anything else, a thin, escalating electronic squeal that began climbing out of the miniature earpiece, pressed tightly against the side of her head. Ilhan Omar had both of her hands raised by this point, desperately attempting to force the noise to stop, swatting at the side of her face the way a person might swat at an invisible insect that only they could hear. A solitary, single sheet of paper lay completely face down right in the middle of the long, polished conference table. She had physically pushed that very paper across the wooden expanse to him herself, exactly 40 minutes earlier, utilizing just 2 fingers and wearing a confident, knowing smile. It was her specific question. She had chosen to write it out completely by hand because she aggressively wanted it recorded on the official record, word for verbatim word, ensuring that nobody could ever step forward later and claim she had been intentionally vague or ambiguous. Right now, Mike Johnson had just one single finger resting lightly on the back of that piece of paper, applying a light pressure similar to a man merely keeping his place in a heavy book, and he was absolutely not smiling, nor was he raising the volume of his voice in the slightest. "You asked me a question, Congresswoman," he stated evenly. "I told you that I would answer the entirety of it. I am just about done." The little earpiece kept singing its horrible, high-pitched song. She finally managed to wrestle it loose from her ear and held it there in her hand, staring at this small, dead plastic thing, and she did not appear to know exactly where she should put it down. To truly understand how a carefully constructed question, a trap she had spent an entire week meticulously building, a question she confidently walked into that hearing room absolutely certain would abruptly end his political career and elevate hers, somehow turned completely around in the air and came flying right back at her, you have to rewind. You have to go back about 40 minutes. Back to the exact moment when she still genuinely believed she was the one securely holding the handle of the knife. "Mr. Speaker, thank you for agreeing to this," she had said, and the manufactured warmth in her tone was clearly designed for the television cameras, and every single person in the room could hear that it was explicitly for the cameras. "I want to keep this very simple today because I think the American people are incredibly tired of hearing long political speeches, and I know that I certainly am." She had smoothly slid the handwritten sheet across the expansive table. It traveled across the polished wood surface and came to a halt right near his resting hands. "That is my question. I physically wrote it down so there is absolutely no confusion later on. I want you to read it out loud for the room, and then I want you to answer it directly, not with a prolonged sermon, but with a verifiable fact." She had explicitly requested this specific arrangement herself. That was the unique element the entire room was still mentally turning over and trying to process. This was not the usual congressional hearing dynamic where the powerful chairman asks the questions and the nervous witness sweats under the pressure. Instead, a sitting Speaker of the House had voluntarily agreed to sit across a table and field hostile questions directly from a member of the political minority. The television cameras were stacked 3 networks deep, and the public gallery was packed all the way to the side rails with eager spectators. People openly called it a trap that she had custom-built just for him. Nobody in the political sphere could figure out why a man known for being so incredibly careful had voluntarily walked into this snare on purpose. She had her earpiece securely in the little wireless model that the committee provided for monitoring the live feed, and she reached up and seated it tighter into her ear canal, a small, unconscious, nervous habit she would end up repeating a dozen times that morning without once thinking about it. And somewhere far back in the 4th row of the gallery sat a quiet man wearing a gray windbreaker, carrying a folded piece of paper securely in his shirt pocket. He was a man who had taken 2 separate city buses just to be there, although nobody in the room knew that particular detail just yet. Johnson calmly picked up the handwritten sheet. He read it to himself first, his lips making slight, almost imperceptible movements, and the entire room watched him read it. And that collective watching built a heavy, profound quiet that no amount of shouting could have ever built. Then, he read it aloud in a flat, perfectly even voice, giving the words absolutely no emotional weight. "The question is," he said, reading from the page, "Mr. Speaker, you and people like you constantly love to question my patriotism. So, I will make it incredibly easy for you. Point to one single line, just one line, in the Constitution of the United States that I have ever violated. Name it right now, or openly admit that this scrutiny has only ever been about the color of my skin and the specific faith that I practice." He deliberately set the sheet back down on the table. "That is a very good question, Congresswoman," he said. "That is a real good question. I mean that sincerely. I have waited a very long time for somebody to finally ask me that one plainly, attaching their own name to it. He smoothly flattened the paper once with 2 fingers, the exact way you would flatten a crumbled store receipt you firmly intended to keep for your records. So, I am going to answer all of it, and I would politely ask you to let me finish my thoughts, purely on account of how carefully you wrote it down, and I would absolutely hate to paraphrase your words incorrectly. She leaned back in her heavy leather chair, looking immensely satisfied. She believed she had him completely cornered on the public record now, publicly committed to defending her personal patriotism in front of the cameras, using a document she had explicitly written herself. In her strategic calculations, there were only 2 possible ways this confrontation went, and she had extensively rehearsed for both of them. Either he fumbled uncomfortably for some vague, standard talking point about loving the American flag, which she would rapidly carve up into a viral social media clip about a Republican speaker who couldn't name a single actual law she had ever broken, or, alternatively, he reached for something real, got angry, and overshot the mark. And she would carve that reaction into a devastating clip about systemic Islamophobia thriving within the people's house. She had strategically built a metaphorical room possessing only 2 doors, and she was confidently standing right in front of both of them. However, she had completely forgotten that there is always a 3rd way to answer a hostile question. You can simply, calmly answer it. Johnson did not reach down for a thick, imposing legal folder. There was no banker's box filled with documents. No dramatic political theater, no towering stack of printouts 6 inches deep. There was only the single sheet she had handed him, and right beside it, a very thin manila folder, maybe a 1/4 of an inch thick when closed. He put his hand completely flat on top of it and deliberately left it closed for the time being. I spent 20 years of my life working as a lawyer before I ever ran for any political office, he stated clearly. Constitutional law, the First Amendment, mostly. Do you want to know what that actually means on a day-to-day basis? It means I spent 2 entire decades of my professional life rigorously defending the right of people to say things that I personally found deeply offensive. That was the core of the job. Somebody says a thing that completely turns your stomach, and you stand up in a court of law, and you legally defend their absolute right to say it anyway. Because the day we finally let the government decide which speech is legally allowed is the exact day that none of us are truly free anymore. He paused, letting the statement hang in the quiet room. I am intentionally telling you that up front, Congresswoman, because I desperately want you to understand the exact type of man you are talking to today. I am the absolute last person in this entire building who is going to look at you and tell you that you cannot say a thing. I have made my entire living standing on the exact opposite principle. Then we agree that this entire hearing is pointless, Omar said quickly. And there, flashing briefly, was the very first edge of that specific smile she always used when she firmly thought she was ahead in the debate. No, ma'am. We do not agree on that at all, because you did not ask me whether or not you had the legal right to say things. You specifically asked me to name a line you crossed. He reached over and tapped her handwritten sheet of paper. You wrote it out yourself. So, let me start actually answering it, and you feel free to tell me if I have paraphrased your intent wrong. He opened the thin manila folder and extracted just 1 single page. He did it without any dramatic flair, using the casual motion you would use to lift a single sheet of paper off the top of a stack sitting at the office copier. He subtly settled his reading glasses slightly lower down on his nose. The exact day you got sworn into this legislative body, he began, you chose to put your hand on your grandfather's Quran. And I want to say something specific about that choice because it matters deeply to where this conversation is going. He looked up, peering over the rims of his glasses. There were plenty of people years back who loudly argued that a person couldn't legally take that oath of office on anything but a traditional Christian Bible. I am sure you remember those people, and let me be clear, they were completely wrong. Flat wrong, as a strict matter of constitutional law, and if I had been serving as your personal lawyer at that time, I would have gladly told them so right to their faces. The Constitution states it in incredibly plain English. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office. You had absolutely every constitutional right to utilize that Quran. And any man who stood there and told you anything different fundamentally did not understand the foundational document he was aggressively claiming to defend. He let that powerful defense sit in the room for a moment. I intensely want that firmly on the permanent record before I go 1 inch further in this discussion, because I am about to be very hard on you. And I critically need you to know that my criticism has got absolutely nothing to do with the religious book you chose to swear your oath upon. The atmosphere in the room had suddenly gone very, very still. Even the busy political reporters had completely stopped writing in their notepads because they could all physically feel the argumentative ground tilting beneath their feet, yet they couldn't quite see which way the structure was going to fall. But here is the important thing about that sworn oath, Congresswoman. It is not just the physical book sitting underneath your hand that actually matters. It is the specific words that come flying out of your mouth on top of it. He looked down and read from the page, his voice slow and perfectly even. Support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He deliberately set the page back down on the table and precisely squared it up against her handwritten question, aligning them edge to edge, the two sheets sitting side by side. Foreign and domestic. That is the core deal. That is the entire deal. You do not get to pick and choose. I have never once, she started, her voice defensive. I am not finished answering your written question, ma'am, he interjected. He said it completely without heat or anger. It was delivered the exact way you would firmly close a door that you weren't trying to slam. You explicitly asked me to take my time and be incredibly specific. I am currently being specific. He slowly drew out the second page from his folder. If you have ever spent any amount of time watching how a genuinely careful man patiently takes apart a deeply careless argument, you know that he never immediately goes for the throat while you are still braced for the impact. He goes incredibly slow. He makes you actively help him dismantle it. There is a very public speech you gave, Johnson continued, in Minneapolis. It was a public event. These are your own recorded words. And I am not going to use the heavily edited version that went around online because the translation on that specific clip was sloppy and I simply do not traffic in sloppy work. I went out and secured the exact transcript of what you actually said. He looked down and read it verbatim. Quote, "The U.S. government will do what we tell the U.S. government to do. We should have that confidence in ourselves. As long as I am in Congress, no one will take Somalia's sea." He looked back up, right over the wire rims of his glasses. Now, I actively want to be fair to you here, because that is the absolute only way doing this is actually worth doing. You were talking openly about a regional port deal, a real international dispute, a completely real foreign policy question, and you have got absolutely every right to hold a firm political position on it. I am not standing here pretending you were secretly plotting treason in a dark basement. A political panel show airing that night tried desperately to litigate the encounter the old, familiar way, featuring three partisan guests, loudly talking over each other about alleged Islamophobia, congressional oversight, and whether or not the hearing format had been fair to begin with. It lasted for about 4 minutes before the host, who had clearly watched the raw, unedited clip on his drive into the studio, firmly held up a hand and ordered them to stop. He said the exact thing that nobody on the panel wanted to be the one to say out loud. He bluntly stated that it did not matter one bit whether the hearing was fair, because she had personally picked the format, she had physically written the question, and she had aggressively pushed it across the table herself. There was absolutely no narrative version of this event where she got to pretend to be the innocent victim it was done to. The other partisan guests quickly went totally quiet. The television segment ended early. That moment, too, became a viral clip. Meanwhile, out in the echoing marble hallway right outside the hearing room, a political reporter managed to catch a Democratic congressman who had faithfully voted alongside Omar plenty of times over the years. He absolutely did not want his real name used for the quote, and he nervously glanced both ways down the long corridor before he said it, acting the exact way men inside that building always act right before they decide to tell the absolute truth. Then he said it, his voice low and speaking incredibly fast. We explicitly told her not to do it. He shook his head. Everybody told her. You do not hand a seasoned constitutional lawyer an open-ended question about the Constitution and boldly ask him to take his time answering it. That is not a trap for him. That is an absolute gift. He shook his head again. She spent 6 entire years getting people to endlessly argue about whether her questions were politically fair instead of just answering them. He just definitively answered it. There is absolutely no comeback to a man who calmly answers. And then the congressman was gone, slipping away before the reporter's audio recorder could even come up. Back in Minneapolis, a man who independently ran a small local auto shop and had faithfully voted for Omar in 3 consecutive elections, watched the viral clip on his mobile phone, leaning on his shop counter between helping customers. And he did not feel triumphant watching it, and he also did not feel betrayed, and he honestly could not have told you exactly what he felt in his chest. He had come to this country himself a very long time ago, arriving with not much more than she'd had when she arrived. He had physically built his repair shop using his own 2 hands. He silently turned the phone face down onto the counter and just stood there for a long minute, staring at the wall. Then, he slowly picked it back up and watched the entire clip again. The specific part where the speaker calmly said that the line wasn't codified in the law, that it existed entirely in the bright daylight between possessing a legal right and doing the decent human thing. He thought about that profound distinction for a very long time. Then a new customer finally walked into the shop, and he slipped the phone back into his pocket, and he went back to working, and he did not talk about it with anyone, but he thought deeply about it for the rest of the day. The quiet man in the gray windbreaker ended up taking 2 different buses back home. He did not turn on his music or listen to a podcast. He just sat silently right by the window, keeping the soft, old printout of the woman's photograph tucked safely back inside his shirt pocket. And somewhere along the second long leg of the commute, with the city lights silently sliding by in the dark glass, he placed his hand completely flat against his chest, right over the pocket, and just left it there. And he did not cry, exactly, but the emotion was a very near thing. He had successfully acquired what he came to the hearing for. Somebody had finally, publicly said it out loud, inside a massive room with all the television cameras switched on. That while she absolutely had a constitutional right to her terrible words, the rest of the country had an equal right to remember exactly who had spoken them. And Mike Johnson, for his specific part, did the exact thing that deeply careful men always do, which is nothing showy or theatrical at all. He did not dramatically gather up the whole manila folder. He deliberately left the text of the oath, the transcript of the speech, and the final printed page sitting right there on the wooden table for the committee staff to eventually collect and file away. He merely reached out and picked up exactly 1 single sheet of paper, the handwritten one, her specific question, the exact one she had confidently pushed across the table to him with 2 fingers and a smirk just 40 minutes before. He folded it once, very neatly straight down the middle, and smoothly slid it into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket. And he calmly stood up, and he walked straight out of that hearing room without uttering one more word to anybody, walking past the flashing cameras, past the shouting reporters calling his name down the marble hall, and walking right past the small, dead plastic earpiece still sitting silently on the table exactly where she had set it down. It was the only thing she had left behind. He had successfully acquired what he came into the room for, too. It was her very own question, written out in her very own hand, and it fit perfectly inside one pocket. "Thank you," she had said during the hearing, her voice dripping with coldness. "But you specifically highlighted that I said the U.S. government will do what we tell it to do. And the specific room you said it to was not your home district, ma'am," Johnson calmly countered. "It wasn't the city of Minneapolis writ large. It was a private room you were directly addressing as one of them, confidently telling them that the sovereign government of the United States would permanently move on their explicit say-so regarding a completely foreign coastline." He laid the transcript page perfectly flat, and I just keep coming back to 2 specific words printed on this other page: foreign and domestic. You formally swore an oath to put the one country first, and then you stood inside a room and explicitly told a foreign cause that your first country would happily take its orders. He took his reading glasses down another notch, staring at her. "I am not saying you broke a codified law, Congresswoman. I am an attorney. I am incredibly careful when deploying that word. I am saying you explicitly asked me to find the line, and I am currently standing right on top of it, reading you your own sworn oath right next to your own recorded speech. And I certainly notice that you have suddenly gone completely quiet." A soft sound moved through the packed gallery. It was not exactly a laugh, but it was yet something leaning heavily toward one. He was not completely done with the page yet, and he held up one hand not directed at her, but rather just a small, flat, authoritative gesture asking the entire room to wait in silence. "And before you try to tell me that that speech is just ancient history," Johnson continued, "I would strongly remind you exactly what your own colleagues chose to do about it. This legislative body formally voted 2 years back to aggressively take you off the Foreign Affairs Committee. Now, you loudly called that partisan politics, and yes, Some of it certainly was. I will not sit here and pretend otherwise. But here is the specific part that truly sticks with me. When that vote was finally done, you went straight to the House floor, and you didn't even try to argue that you had been historically right. You stood up, and you loudly asked the room a completely different question. You said, and I wrote it down this morning so I would have it exactly right, "This debate is fundamentally about who gets to be an American." He slowly looked up. It is the exact same question, word for verbatim word. The identical one written on this sheet you smugly handed me this morning. You have been aggressively asking the country the exact same question for years, Congresswoman. And every single time, you conveniently ask it right after somebody directly quotes you back to yourself. That is absolutely not a coincidence. That is a calculated political method. That specific question is the emergency door you desperately run through whenever the room finally remembers what you actually said. She nervously reached up and touched the plastic earpiece again, a small, completely unconscious thing, seating it even tighter against her ear canal. She had done it a dozen times already that morning, and she would undoubtedly do it a dozen more. It was the physical gesture of a panicked person who desperately needed to stay connected to the live feed, to the energy of the room, to the comforting sound of her own perceived advantage. She did not know yet that the little communication device only functioned as long as there was ambient noise for it to carry. She did not know that the absolute deadliest thing that could ever happen to it was a massive room going completely, totally silent. That disaster was still half an hour away. She had been in this exact position before, though. She deeply knew this rhetorical terrain, and she did the exact thing she always instinctively did whenever the floor shifted beneath her feet, which was to immediately attempt to change what the fight was actually about. "I know exactly what this display is," she said, her voice finding its old, familiar strength because pure anger was a country where she had always felt entirely safe. "This is a white Christian nationalist condescendingly lecturing a Muslim refugee about patriotism and loyalty. You really want to talk about the Constitution? Let us talk about the specific part you always skip over, the part explicitly about freedom of religion. Because every single word you are saying to me right now, you would never not in 1,000 years say to a white Christian man who sat exactly where I am sitting. This is not legitimate congressional oversight. This is simply the oldest prejudice story in this country, just wearing a slightly nicer suit. And everyone watching this broadcast knows it. And give her this much credit because it was undeniably real. The room physically moved with her. It was a clean, practiced punch thrown by an experienced fighter who had successfully landed it 100 times before. A loyal staffer sitting directly behind her nodded hard in agreement. A reporter's pen instantly started moving fast across the paper. A woman seated near the front row, who had been intently leaning forward, now nervously sat back, looking completely uncertain, the emotional tilt of the room reversing rapidly under her. The old, familiar reflex was actively moving through the place like a live electrical current, the deeply trained American flinch, the overwhelming, ingrained instinct to immediately step backward from that explosive accusation rather than bravely answering the actual thing underneath it. It held the room captive for about 20 seconds, and it absolutely might have held much longer, but Johnson did not flinch. And he did not soften his posture, and he absolutely did not do the expected thing that the accusation was specifically built to make him do. He calmly took off his reading glasses, and he deliberately folded the arms, and he set them down on the table right beside her handwritten question. And when he finally spoke, his voice had gone very, very quiet. So incredibly quiet that the entire massive room had to physically lean in just to catch it. "Congresswoman," he said softly, "I am going to say something right now. And I intensely want the folks sitting at home to hear it very slow. I spent 8 entire years of my professional life working as a lawyer, actively defending the religious liberty of people who were completely not Christian. I defended Muslims, I defended Jews, I defended folks who possessed no faith at all. I proudly stood in courtrooms and I aggressively fought for a Muslim man's legal right to keep his traditional beard, and I fought for a young Muslim girl's right to wear her headscarf inside a school that illegally tried to ban it. And I did it because the First Amendment of the Constitution is absolutely not a Christian amendment. It is a profoundly American one, and it legally covers you entirely whether I personally share your faith or not." He held her eyes, refusing to look away. "So, you picked the absolute wrong man to publicly call a religious bigot over a headscarf. I am the exact fellow who would have gladly taken your legal case for free. I would have physically stood between you and anybody who ever tried to make you swear your oath on a religious book that wasn't yours." He let one heavy, silent beat pass, which inevitably means you do not get to use that specific word in this room today to magically get out of answering your very own question. You physically handed me the question. The issue is about your sworn oath. It is absolutely not about your scarf. And you completely know it's not. And desperately reaching for that excuse is the absolute tell. The deeply trained, nervous flinch completely left the room. What instantly came rushing in to replace it was so much worse for her political survival. It was profound permission. That right there, a man who had successfully built his legal career defending the religious liberty of actual Muslims, looking her right in the eye and telling her she could no longer hide behind the powerful word she had successfully hidden behind for years. "You want to talk about my record?" she said, her delivery fast and low and visibly furious. "Now, I have spent my entire time serving in this body, aggressively fighting for the people this government completely forgot. I came to this country possessing absolutely nothing. Nothing. Living in a refugee camp, and then a cramped one-bedroom apartment, and trying to master a language I had to learn by watching television. I rigorously earned my American citizenship. I legitimately earned this congressional seat in a district that has explicitly chosen me again and again. And you arrogantly want to reduce all of that, an entire lifetime of struggle, to a thin folder you merely printed out this morning just so you could manufacture a viral clip for people who will never even know my true name and never actually want to. I will absolutely not apologize for the massive size of the hard questions I choose to ask about this country. Truly loving a place fundamentally means telling it the harsh truth. And it was genuinely good. For a brief, fleeting moment, her defense was genuinely, undeniably good, and some of the supportive heat briefly came rushing back to her side of the gallery. Johnson politely let her finish her entire impassioned speech. He let every single word of it land in the room. And then, for the absolute first time all morning, the fundamental gentleness completely vanished out of his voice, and what was left underneath was entirely flat and perfectly level and bitterly cold, and the rhetorical gloves finally came off and did not go back on. Nobody is reducing your life, Congresswoman. You arrived here with nothing and you built something incredibly significant, and I would gladly shake your hand in profound respect for that in absolutely any parking lot in America. That personal journey is not what is on trial here today. What is actually on trial is exactly one thing, the specific thing you explicitly asked me to find. He deliberately put one firm finger on her handwritten question and slowly slid it back to the absolute center of the polished table, positioning it perfectly between them so the television cameras clearly caught the motion. You keep loudly telling me that truly loving a place means telling it the truth. Fine, I will gladly take that deal. He reached deep into the manila folder and drew out the final, next page. So, let us deeply examine a specific truth you said out loud, directly in front of a massive crowd, totally on the public record. Years back, speaking at a fundraiser, you explicitly talked about the absolute worst day this entire country has ever had in my lifetime. 3,000 innocent people murdered. Mothers, brave firemen, a fellow who simply kissed his kids goodbye in the morning and never came back home. He read the transcript completely flat, giving it absolutely nothing, which was the absolute only way it could be born in that room. And you chose to describe what tragically happened that day as, quote, "Some people did something." He slowly set the page down on the table. Some people did something. He let that horrific phrase sit alone in the massive room for a long moment, and the terrified room let it sit there. Now, I have clearly heard the defense. I have painstakingly read the entire speech, examining the full context. All of it. You were speaking about civil liberties for Muslim Americans, and that is a completely real subject, and you possessed absolutely every right to publicly raise it. His voice stayed perfectly level. But there were plenty of other words readily available to you that morning, Congresswoman. Very plain words. Murder. Terror. 3,000 dead. You are arguably the most verbally fluent person operating in this entire building. You absolutely do not run short on vocabulary words, and the specific 4 words you consciously reached for while standing in front of a very friendly crowd were, "Some people did something." He slowly took his glasses completely off. That is not a foreign translation problem. That is absolutely not a short clip taken completely out of its original context. That was a calculated choice about exactly how much weight to publicly give the dead. And the entire country heard exactly how much weight you decided to give them. Down deep in the 4th row, The quiet man in the gray windbreaker had slowly taken the folded piece of paper completely out of his shirt pocket without quite realizing he had actually done it, and he was now holding it tightly in both of his hands. It was an incredibly old printout, gone completely soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded over a very long time. It was a clear photograph of a smiling woman. He did not dramatically stand up. He did not shout a single word. He just quietly held it exactly where he could clearly see it, the exact way you hold on to a precious thing when somebody powerful has finally said out loud the heavy sentence you had been carrying completely alone for years. A man drove 2 buses just to sit silently in a hearing room and hold a picture of someone he lost on that specific day. He never needed to say a word. He didn't need to, because the Speaker of the House perfectly said it for him. Johnson carefully laid 2 fingers heavily on her handwritten question, where it sat directly between them, pinning it firmly in place so the cameras caught it. "There is exactly one more," he stated. "The most recent one, and this is the one I would respectfully ask the entire room to get completely quiet for. Not to laugh, just to hear." The massive room instantly got completely quiet. "A man was brutally murdered last year," Johnson said slowly. "Shot directly in front of a horrified crowd, shot right in front of his wife, a young father leaving behind 2 little kids. You vehemently disagreed with near everything that man publicly believed, and you had every constitutional right to, and I would have legally defended your right to violently debate him for the rest of his natural life. But he wasn't debating that day. He was physically dying. And in the terrible days after, while his grieving widow was frantically planning how to bury him, you actively went on camera more than once, and you explicitly said his entire legacy belonged directly in the dustbin of history. You aggressively said there was absolutely no legacy left to honor. A man's orphaned children are going to eventually grow up and watch that terrible clip someday, Congresswoman. They are going to watch a sitting member of the United States Congress loudly tell the entire country there was absolutely nothing about their father worth remembering while his body was still physically warm. He set the final page down incredibly gently, like he was respectfully laying it to rest. "I have fiercely defended ugly speech my entire career. I strictly defend your constitutional right to say even that horrific thing. The legal right is completely real." His voice dropped down one more full notch. "But you specifically asked me to name the line. And the line you are looking for isn't codified in the law, ma'am. You were completely right about that. There is absolutely no statute. The line is the explicit one between a person who possesses the legal right to say a thing and a person who possesses the basic human decency not to. You have spent an entire career aggressively standing on the very first one and constantly pretending it is the second one. And I truly think the people watching this broadcast can finally see the bright daylight between them." Nobody dared laugh at that. It went down somewhere much deeper than a laugh, sinking into the profound part of a room that permanently decides things. She frantically reached for the safe thing then, the practiced political move that had never once failed her, and the next 60 seconds were the part absolutely nobody in that room saw coming, least of all her. "This entire debate," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "has absolutely never once been about an oath or a single speech or a tweet. It is fundamentally about a very simple question. Who is truly allowed to get to be an American? Whether a black woman, a Muslim woman, a former refugee, can freely sit in this chair and ask incredibly hard questions without being constantly told You absolutely did ask a hard question," Johnson interrupted. "Quiet." He did not aggressively raise his voice over hers. He merely laid his words perfectly underneath hers, and she abruptly stopped talking because you simply could not talk over how incredibly soft his tone was. "You explicitly asked me to vividly name the line, and I have spent 40 solid minutes answering every single word of it using quotes straight from your own mouth and your own sworn oath. Not one single fact did I make up. Not one single quote did I twist. You physically handed me this challenge." He picked up her handwritten sheet of paper, the original question, and held it completely up so the entire room could clearly see her own distinct handwriting upon it. "And the definitive answer to your specific question, Congresswoman, is that you have been aggressively asking the entire country to mistake your legal rights for your moral conduct for years, and the country just closely watched you attempt it one more time in real time, and completely fail." He calmly set the page back down. "You aggressively asked. America comprehensively answered. 4 simple words. And they completely did what 400 never would not have." Ilhan Omar instinctively reached up toward her ear. It was absolutely not a conscious decision. It was merely the small, reflexive thing a panicked person does when the silence in the room suddenly gets entirely too loud, desperately reaching for the absolute one communication device in the room, still actively feeding her comforting sound. But the massive room had gone so completely quiet, so totally devoid of ambient noise, that the live feed earpiece had absolutely nothing left to carry, and deep in that suffocating dead air, it managed to catch the absolutely only thing there was left to catch, the faint, open hum of its very own internal circuit. And it instantly began to aggressively whine. A thin, rapidly rising electronic squeal climbing right against the side of her skull in a room where you absolutely could have heard a pin drop straight onto the carpet. Every single camera caught her violent flinch. She frantically pressed it, desperately trying to force it to stop. It just climbed higher in pitch. She finally got two trembling fingers hooked around it and violently pulled it loose. And the shrill whine cut off the exact instant it violently left her ear. And the profound silence that instantly rushed in behind it was somehow significantly worse than the terrible sound had ever been. She just sat there, frozen, holding the small, dead earpiece right in her open palm, staring at it, this tiny little thing that had been constantly feeding her the energy of the room all morning long and had somehow deliberately chosen this exact horrifying moment to violently scream. And then she set it straight down onto the polished table incredibly carefully, using both hands, the exact careful way you slowly set down something you no longer trust. And she quietly folded her hands in her lap, and she said absolutely nothing at all. The committee chairman loudly cleared his throat right into the profound quiet and formally asked whether the gentlewoman wished to continue her allotted questioning. She absolutely did not wish to continue her questioning. That specific sound, the plastic earpiece violently screaming inside a totally silent room on live national television, the absolutely one device she'd trusted to keep her securely connected, violently turning on her directly in front of the entire country, that is the exact sound of a sophisticated trap, violently closing on the very person who carefully built it. By the absolute time the official hearing eventually gave out, the short clip already had a permanent name, and the name attached to it was hers. And it was absolutely not kind. Somebody had perfectly cut it clean. Exactly 40 devastating seconds. Omar confidently sliding her very own handwritten question completely across the table, wearing that little confident smile. And then the incredibly long, flat, devastating answer built entirely out of her very own recorded words. And then her frantically reaching up to an earpiece that violently screamed and violently pulling it loose and going completely, totally silent. By mid-afternoon, you absolutely could not scroll for even 10 seconds on any digital screen anywhere in the entire country without the clip violently surfacing. And here was the exact part that absolutely should have frightened her the most. If she had been somehow able to feel absolutely anything, yet past the burning heat rising in her face. People entirely weren't aggressively arguing about it. They entirely weren't loudly fighting about Israel or Somalia or systemic Islamophobia or absolutely any of the enormous political things she had confidently walked right into that room to make the hearing entirely about. There was absolutely nothing left to argue about. She had explicitly, aggressively asked a man to vividly name the line, and he had patiently named it incredibly gently for 40 solid minutes, and then she had violently pulled a screaming machine completely out of her own ear. Millions of people were just quietly watching that exactly on a constant loop, and going completely quiet the exact way the massive room had completely gone quiet. The primetime evening news broadcasts universally led with the exact same still frame, Omar, and her very own handwritten question held completely up across the polished table firmly in the speaker's hand, her distinct name clearly visible on the paper in her very own ink. One major news network just ran it silently under a simple chyron that was absolutely nothing but 4 short words, plain white letters against a solid black background. "You asked?" America answered. Absolutely no additional political commentary added. Absolutely none was ever needed.